abzcook.com, and today we are going to talk about substituting ingredients in a recipe when you don't have the right ingredients to follow that recipe. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who's struggling with this right now. And the reality is, when you're trying to avoid going to the grocery store and you're trying to just feed your family pretty well in this season, but not go to the grocery store every time, then you have to wing it for a lot of recipes. And so I'm going to show you one of our favorite recipes that is very forgiving when you are winging it, and hopefully some of the substitutions that I use here will give you some ideas for maybe ways that you can translate that to other recipes that you know and love. We're going to be working off of the recipe that is in the link in the description. It is beef and veggie soup. It's just like a ground beef and vegetable soup. Very comforting, very easy, budget friendly, and you're going to see that I am hardly following the recipe at all because we don't have a lot of the stuff that the recipe calls for. So hopefully this will inspire you and give you some encouragement. And then meanwhile, I would love to hear from you what you've made this week that you had to kind of wing it. So something that you had to make up. Either you thought you had the stuff and you realized you didn't and you couldn't just run to the grocery store and get it, or something that you were planning to make and then your kids ate the stuff that you were supposed to use, and so then you had to figure something out. So let me know in the comments below what you've made this week. That's been a great learning experience, and we can get on with this thing. So I'm going to use my Instant Pot because it was easier to do a video with the Instant Pot, but you can do this on the stovetop, no problem. So I'm setting it to the saute setting, and my phone is a little short, so I'm going to change that real quick. Here we go. Is that better? I think my tripod is a little old, so it falls over time. So throughout this video, you might see me like doing this number. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and start the soup. And the first thing that we're going to do is put some oil in here. For oil, when you are sauteing vegetables, if you run out of oil, that's okay. You can use some coconut oil if you have it. Usually coconut oil is neutral flavored enough that even if you're doing like a very flavorful, like savory soup, you could just use coconut oil. You can use olive oil. You can use butter too. Butter works just fine. In fact, it is crazy delicious in soups, so don't be afraid of the butter if you can find any at the grocery stores. So I'm going to go ahead and chop up my onion. And for some of us who don't have onion, I've actually successfully made soup recipes with just using like minced onion. So this is the dry minced onion that you can get from the store. You can get them in like big containers in Costco, and that could be like a good stock up your pantry with shelf-stable food kind of ingredient. But onions actually last a really long time in the fridge, and not in the fridge, in the pantry, and you don't really want to store them in the fridge. And so that's a good thing, like when you're at the grocery store next and you're trying to avoid going to the grocery store for a while, to go ahead and get a lot of onions because they will last a while, and if they start going bad, you can actually chop them just like I did here and put them in a freezer bag, and they freeze just fine, and then you can use them in soup recipes or use them just however you would other onions. So the other thing that I'm doing right now is I'm taking the onion skins and like that first weird layer of onion, and I'm not throwing it away. I'm setting it aside because I have a freezer bag in my fridge, or in my freezer, that I fill with like onion skins and the ends of carrots or the bits of celery, and I use those to make vegetable broth or chicken broth, whatever kind of broth we need. And that way I am using stuff that would normally be trash, and I don't need to use the regular stuff that I would use in soups or whatever, but I'm still making like a really flavorful broth in the process. So that's 1 onion, and then carrots. So a lot of recipes call for onion and carrots and celery. So this is some celery that I pre-chopped yesterday. And sauteing those 3 things before you put the rest of the stuff in the recipe makes it just adds this really great depth of flavor to the soup. It's like this whole French thing that it's like necessary for good flavor in your food. Which is why you may have noticed that like crock pot soups where you just dump everything in and you don't saute any of it usually aren't as flavorful by themselves as like soups where you actually saute the stuff, because you haven't developed that flavor. Let me know if you can't hear me. So for those of you who are just joining us, we are going to talk about substituting ingredients, and we're following a recipe that my family loves, but we don't actually have most of the stuff that the recipe calls for right now, and I don't want to go to the grocery store. So I am just showing you how we can substitute what we have with what the recipe calls for and still make a really delicious dinner that our family will love. So we are sauteing onions right now, and I want to give you this tip. If your recipe calls for onions, carrots, and celery, it's okay if you don't have any celery. Quite often I've made really great soup just with some carrots and some onions. Carrots and onions last a really long time in the fridge. Celery lasts an okay amount of time, but it's not the same as carrots and onions. Sorry, you shouldn't store onions in the fridge. They last in the pantry. And so, usually in recipes, I just use carrots and onions, and they turn out fine. Of course, they're better with celery, but don't feel like you're going to ruin the soup because you didn't have celery. Alright, so this is 1 carrot. I'm going to put it in with the onions. And we've got this end. I'm going to put this in a pile with my onions, and this is all going to go in the broth bag in the fridge, or in the freezer, so that I can make some broth later this week. And I don't need to use our regular carrots and onions and celery for that, because I'm trying to avoid going to the grocery store. And this is something that we do even if we're like on a normal day. We always have a broth bag in the freezer all the time, no matter how big the grocery budget is, because it's just a good frugal practice. It doesn't take that much time and helps us save money and eat healthy, so I can't really complain. There's the last end of the carrot, and the rest of the carrots go in here. And we're just going to let those saute. And because I happen to have celery, these are all like the white little baby bits of the celery, the good bits of the celery that everybody wants to eat. I just slice those, and we can use them with like peanut butter and raisins. I usually use the bits that nobody wants to eat for our soups. That way, we're using up what we have, and we're not wasting anything. A lid on that so I don't have to shout over the sauteing sound. Does that work? Alright, so this is hamburger vegetable soup. So it's ground beef and other stuff and vegetables. And the thing is, I don't really have much ground beef right now. We have some in the fridge, but my son seasoned it for like taco meat, and I have a better idea. I could throw in the taco meat beef in here, and we can make it more of like a taco-y soup, and it'll be great, it'll be delicious. But I have this instead. The recipe also calls for diced tomatoes, so I wanted to show you, we don't have any diced tomatoes right now, but what we do have is crushed tomatoes, because there were 4 of these left at Kroger after everyone panic bought all of their food. So we have crushed tomatoes, and then we have tomato puree, which is just like a tomato sauce kind of thing, but it's plain, it's not flavored. because this was the other 4 cans left in the tomato section after everyone panic bought their food. And so if a recipe calls for diced tomatoes and it's like a soup or a chili or something like that, you can go ahead and substitute crushed tomatoes and tomato puree and it'll work fine. The flavor is more concentrated in both of these. Like this is more concentrated than diced and this is more concentrated than the crushed tomatoes. But you can use either one and it'll taste fine. We do it all the time. But today we have some spaghetti sauce left over, and this actually has some ground beef in it because we made spaghetti the other day and I mixed the sauce and the ground beef together and then I just put it back in this jar to store in the fridge. And it's been a couple of days and we have to use this now. So instead of using an extra pound of ground beef, then I'm just going to throw this in and there'll be a little bit of meat in there and it'll be fine. And then because we're not using a whole lot of meat, I am going to cook up some navy beans. They're like smaller little white beans, and they're used, like you can see them being used in like Italian style soups like minestrone and things like that. So this will go perfectly with our spaghetti sauce-ish themed thing. So I'm using this instead of the diced tomatoes and the ground beef. And then I'm using this to add some bulk to the meal because I'm not using a lot of meat in there. And I don't want it to just be plain vegetable soup because that won't stick to my family's ribs very well. So the beans will help. And I'll actually cook these separately. It almost fell. Alright. So these are done sauteing. And I'm going to put in some garlic. If you don't have fresh garlic makes a big difference flavor-wise, but you can use a 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder for 1 clove of garlic. So it's a 1/4 teaspoon garlic powder for 1 clove of garlic, and I use that across the board, whether that's in like dips or sauces or with like a roast or roast chicken or anything like that. You can use garlic powder instead of a garlic clove. So I mince the garlic-ish, chop it, whatever. That's going in there. And I only use 2 because this guy's got garlic in it already. So, and I don't want to use up all of my garlic cloves, so I want some fresh garlic in there to like add the nutrition value to the soup. But I'm going to go ahead and probably sprinkle a little bit of this in there too, just to up the garlic flavor. So that's good in there. This is another thing that we have. This is like leftover pizza sauce because we made pizza a couple days ago. And this is our like super cheap, quick homemade pizza sauce where you just take this, it was a can of this guy, and some of our Greek seasoning that we have a recipe for on the blog. And the Greek seasoning is just very basic spices that you probably already have in your spice cabinet, and you just mix them all up together, and you can use it for all kinds of things, but you can also use it for pizza sauce. So that way you make like a pizza sauce that doesn't have sugar in it or anything like that. So I'm going to use this and this, and I'll add some water to make it better. Just fill it up because it's soup. Let me grab my water. I have like ingredient measurements. Wow, it's so quiet in here. It's so nice. I have ingredient measurements on the recipe that's in the link in the video description. But as you can see here, I'm not actually measuring anything because I'm not really following the recipe anyway, and I've made this enough times that it's okay. And the wonderful thing about cooking is that for certain things, the measurements really matter, but for things like quarantine soup where you can't go to the grocery store, measurements don't matter as much, so just do what you gotta do, right? So that's going in there. And because I'm a cheapskate, I don't want to lose any of the sauce. So I pour some water in there, put the lid on it, and shake it. And there we go. We got like all the sauce in there. And we're gonna do the same thing with this guy. So pour in the sauce. Now, see, look at that. It's like congealed. That's because there was some olive oil in the sauce, and the tomato sauce is more concentrated than like the tomato puree. It's not tomato sauce, it's tomato puree. It's a different, kind of slightly different thing. So that's another reason why I want to add plenty of water to the soup, because I don't want it to taste like spaghetti sauce. It's supposed to be soup. So add a little more water to this. So now we have a good basic soup base. And then the other thing that this recipe calls for is, which is optional for the recipe, is like shredded cabbage and chopped spinach. So I don't have any cabbage and I don't have any greens of any kind. But generally speaking, for soups, I feel very comfortable substituting. If a recipe calls for cabbage, then I might just throw some spinach in there instead, or some kale. They're all kind of from the same vegetable family, so there's some leeway there. You can also, like if a recipe calls for spinach, and I just have like those baby power greens or something like that, like a smoothie blend baby greens mix from the grocery store, I'll just put that in there instead. So there's flexibility there. The one thing that I will say, if you're putting greens in a soup, you really want to chop them first. If I'm making soup just for me, I'll just throw them in there because I like greens in my soup. But for family members who are like, oh, this is so big and green and gross, then you kind of want to chop it so that they can enjoy their meal a little better. But they're still eating the same thing, but it's just a little more palatable. So I don't have any of those things for this soup, and we're gonna have beans in here, but the soup is still kind of like meh. And the other thing that I am comfortable with substituting for like cabbage and spinach and stuff like that in this particular soup recipe, but in a lot of soup recipes, if I'm honest, is frozen broccoli and peas. Okay? The reason why we have so much of this right now is because, and here's a little tip that maybe you know, maybe you don't, but when we bought food at the grocery store like 2.5 weeks ago, we bought a ton of fresh fruits and veggies, and we've just spent the last 2 weeks working our way through them, eating the ones that were going to go bad first, saving the ones that were kind of like in that middle ground, and I think we have like a little container of lettuce left and some celery, and and the carrots, but carrots last a really long time, so they don't really count. But that's it for a lot of our fresh fruits and veggies. But we also stocked up on a lot of frozen ones, so that we were still getting plenty of fresh fruits and veggies for 2 weeks, but now we have the frozen ones to fall back on, and they can just stay in the freezer until we're ready for them. So when you're cooking in the Instant Pot, here's just a little Instant Pot tip. You should not cook broccoli in there or green peas, because the high heat of the Instant Pot will just, it'll overcook them, and it's gross. I think most of the reason why people don't like cooked broccoli is because they've had overcooked broccoli, and it's just gross. It doesn't taste good. So what I do for the Instant Pot is I cook the whole thing first for like, I think in this case the carrots are the things that take the longest to cook, so I'll cook it for 2 minutes, okay, on pressure. That's just an Instant Pot thing. And then I will stir in the peas and the broccoli and put the lid back on and let it cook let it just sit on warm. and just the heat itself, without needing to, you know, turn it on, the Instant Pot on again or anything, will cook the broccoli and the peas, and it'll be great. And then I'll stir in these beans, which, like I said, I will cook separately. And the reason why I cook separately is because these take like 20 to 30 minutes to cook. And if I did that at the same time as I did the soup, then the celery and the carrots and the onions and everything, it would just it would taste gross after being cooked for that long in the Instant Pot. So I'm cooking the dry beans separately. And then I have some leftover rice that we're probably gonna throw in there too, because that's delicious. Or if a lot of times when you when like a soup recipe or something will call for some kind of carb, you can substitute the carbs. So you could do I could do chopped potatoes in here. I could even do sweet potatoes in here, and that would taste pretty good. Well, maybe not with the spaghetti sauce kind of vibe we've got going. I could do elbow macaroni, which I've done before, and you could do quinoa. We did that last week. We had quinoa in the soup instead. Or if you're trying to do more keto or grain-free or something like that, cauliflower is a good, inexpensive, neutral vegetable. I mean, if we can make it into pizza, we can make it into anything, right? So chop up the cauliflower, put that in there, and then it'll add more bulk to your soup while still making it like, you know, full of veggies and stuff like that. So that's our little rundown on substituting ingredients, and I hope it helped seeing like me actually making a recipe. I have some more tips. If you check the link in the description, then that actually has a video on it where I talk about substituting a little more. And there's a link in the description for 35 ingredients, the only 35 ingredients that you need to cook budget-friendly, real food meals. And so the next time you go to the grocery store, if you make sure that you have that list in your kitchen, you can make a huge variety of food. And so I made that list available to you guys. Let me know if you get the list and if you end up shopping with it, because it has saved our bacon many, many times. And I just wanted to give you something so that you could maybe get some good ideas for this season that we're in. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will talk to you again later.